to hear that I've spent hundreds and hundreds of hours preparing this talk in light of what happened less than 24 hours ago. So the events are a moving target, and you're going to be getting kind of views in real time rather than 100-hour-long prepared reactions to events. The title that Dave and I settled on like a million years ago, 36 hours before now, in light of this pace of change, was "Where are we and where are we going?" And so in an attempt to speak to that, where are we? And in particular, last week we talked about a variety of potentially very dark scenarios that could unfold if actors in the American political system chose to respect the letter of the law but not the spirit of the law. What could happen? And the answer is things that would be very, very dark. At the moment, the horizon looks brighter than that, but dark scenarios are still possible. The politics of the moment are quite dynamic, and there's in particular a chance still for significant violence, to the extent that a number of armed groups that clearly are not happy about the idea of a Biden presidency are signaled to take action and take that action. And we could talk more in Q&A if you like about the prospect for militia violence or other bad things going on at this point. But the darkest of the scenarios of a week ago now seems substantially less likely, and that raises the interesting puzzle of why. Because all of the same letter of the law but not spirit of the law options we talked about a week ago are still open, right? The gravest of those involved Republican legislatures using their letter of the law power to override the stated preference of voters in an election and instead send a Trumpist slate of electors to Washington regardless of the way states voted. That scenario has long been the most dangerous and now looks extremely unlikely. And the reason that it's now, I think, very unlikely is richly ironic. It's largely because the Republicans did better on the down ballot races than they did at the top. For the Republican legislature in the state of Pennsylvania, for example, to follow the president's lead and say there are too many irregularities in this voting for us to accept it as the true will of the people. We don't know what the will of the people is. Our vote is Trumpist. We're sending a Trumpist slate of electors. What that means is they're overturning an election that elected them. Right at this point, given where we are, right in the voting process, it would require multiple states overturning the apparent will of the people to elect them. And I think what that's created is tremendous reluctance on the part of the institutional Republican Party, the leadership of the party at the state level and at the national level outside the Oval Office, to pursue these legal options as aggressively as they are able to and as aggressively as they gave some thought to doing. Again, we know for a fact that the state Senate majority leader in Pennsylvania and the state Republican Party chairman in Pennsylvania both gamed out this scenario. And I think, ironically, if Democrats had been more successful last Tuesday, these scenarios would be more dangerous today. Now, if it had been a landslide in favor of Biden, that would also have been, a low chaos scenario for other reasons. The scenario most people were worried about, though, when they were talking about these kind of dark possibilities, is a close but consistent election in which Democrats win the White House by a sliver of a margin, and Democrats flip the Senate by a sliver of a margin, right? And that scenario gives institutional Republicans an incentive, if they are prepared to ignore the spirit of the law, to push their advantages in the letter of the law to the limit all the way to the Supreme Court, all sorts of grave possibilities. That would be remarkably self-destructive at this point for a majority of current Republican office holders. Now, there are a variety of Republican voices that are nonetheless calling for exactly this still, even now. So the president's sons, for example, are pretty explicitly calling for state legislatures to override the vote. There have been a variety of voices in senior elected Republicans not speaking institutionally on behalf of the party, but for themselves. You know, Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley, lots of voices in the Twitter sphere, lots of voices in Trump-friendly opinion outlets that are calling on them to do these things. My own sense of the prognosis of all that at the moment is that it's radically less likely to succeed than it appeared as recently as Monday. And that I think a lot of what's going on with this at the moment is less an expectation that this is actually going to happen and that it would succeed if it happened, than positioning for the intra-Republican fight that's going to start almost immediately, where the result of the election strongly suggests that there is a very large constituency in the United States that is basically sympathetic to the broad, cultural-political perspective of the Trump administration, might prefer it to be done with less chaos, right? Might prefer it to be done with less brutality and kind of gratuitous insulting of opponents, but generally feel that the Democratic Party is not reflecting their interests or their sense of identity and is up for grabs right now. It's long been expected that if Trump lost, there would be a peaceful civil war within the Republican Party between business traditionalists and pro-Trumpist populists. And the expectation has been that the Republican office holders just sort of sort themselves into these two categories. That I think is happening already before any actual changeover of power. But ironically, the nature of that fight even is tending to depress the probability of kind of dark, push the letter of the law to its limits scenarios, because a lot of the people who want to pick up the Trumpist imprimatur, Cruz, Cotton, Hawley, for instance, are worried that Trump himself will run again. Or that if Trump himself doesn't run in 2024, Donald Jr. or Eric will. And they're trying to position themselves to capture that constituency away from its current champion. And to do that, the idea, if you're, to do a really bizarre thought experiment, let us all put ourselves in Ted Cruz's shoes and kind of look at the world through his lens. The ideal scenario from the standpoint of a Cruz or a Cotton or a Hawley or others of that kind is for the president to humiliate himself now. To lose, but humiliate himself, and preferably to take his family down with him, because that enables them to inherit this constituency in a relatively straightforward way without a meaningful competition for it. And so if you kind of do these Talmudic readings of the thoughts of Ted Cruz, I don't know whether I would recommend that to anyone necessarily, but if you do that, what it looks like he's trying to do is not actually support the state legislature in Pennsylvania overturning the vote, but sound sympathetic to concerns with the validity of the election and leave the door open for Trump's family to pursue this and flame out in the process. Anyway, what all that suggests, I think, is we're probably not going to have the apparent electoral result overturned in the courts, because that would require large-scale cooperation of elected Republicans who just got elected and no longer have an incentive to do that. So if the current situation looks brighter with respect to the prospects for chaos than it might have a week ago, what about where from here? Looking forward into a presumptive Biden administration. And here there are two scenarios, dark and brighter. As those of you who showed the lack of judgment associated with coming to my talks at Christ Presbyterian in the past will recall, my usual shtick is I'm the pessimist. And I show up and tell you how grim the future looks, how dark the prognosis in Afghanistan is, or Iraq, or the collapse of alliances, or the general decline of Western civilization. It's just part of this get off my lawn thing that you expect. My hair color and orientation. Actually, at the moment, and my dear wife tends to disagree with me on this, right? You heard from Tammy earlier. At the moment, I tend toward the brighter of the scenarios. I think there is a serious opportunity for a very productive change in American politics. Tammy, I think, still tends to see the darker possibility as higher probability than I do, but I'll let her defend her own views on this. I'll just disagree with them without her being able to say anything about it. She's sitting in the next room trying to pretend she doesn't hear me. So let's start with the dark scenario, though, because that's less jarring in terms of your expectations from me, right? So the dark scenario is Republican control of the Senate in the hands of Mitch McConnell creates a serious possibility of deadlock, dysfunction, and descent into a failed state. So when Barack Obama took office in 2009, Mitch McConnell famously declared, internally, but nonetheless widely publicized, that his mission was to ensure that Obama becomes a one-term president. Sorry about that, Mitch, but it didn't work out. But the plan was Stonewall, right? Do nothing that would give a legislative victory to the new administration. Use the filibuster to prevent action, and then hang that on the administration's neck in 4 years as a way to vote them out of office.
Husky may have fallen asleep.
Well, that's an understandable reaction. And after all, it's such a boring moment in American politics. If he does that, he has the power to do that again. If he does that again, right, then we're going to end up with another train wreck electorally, quite possibly in 4 more years, because his power to do that is really quite unusual at the moment. It's very rare for a change, for a president to come into office with a change of party and not control the Senate. In this environment where Biden doesn't, McConnell could block his appointments. He could prevent the formation of a government, right? You cannot get cabinet officials seated and able to function in the US government without an upvote in the Senate. All McConnell has to do is refuse to allow a vote. He doesn't even have to deal with defectors in the Republican coalition. He can simply say, I'm the majority leader, I control the agenda, no votes for you. And so we get no Secretary of Defense, no Secretary of State, no Attorney General, right? No anything. Much less a new stimulus bill, much less an infrastructure bill, right? Much less federal action to ease the pandemic. All that, I mean, all those things require votes in the Senate that McConnell can simply prevent. If he chooses to do so, he can create complete deadlock. Now, there are some safety valves around this, right? So when it comes to appointment of the cabinet, for example, President-elect Biden could use recess appointments, right? Wait till the Senate is out of Washington and then appoint cabinet officials. That's permitted under the Constitution. The trouble is they have to be confirmed by the end of the next session of the Senate, or else they must leave office. And what that does in practical terms is it means you get a maximum of 1 to 1.5 years of time in position for anybody you would appoint that way. Alternatively, he can use the Vacancies Act, which enables you to appoint to cabinet level positions people who have been previously confirmed by the Senate or in certain senior civil service positions. but that has an even shorter fuse on it. You can't serve for any more than 210 days in that status. So even with these kind of workarounds, if McConnell wants to, he can literally prevent a functioning government from being assembled. Now, why isn't it? Mitch McConnell is not a kind of a good government idealist in my view. Why don't I think this is likely, given that it is possible? And I don't think it's likely because my own mental model of Mitch McConnell is that I think he's a cynic, but I don't think he's a revolutionary. My sense from his behavior in the past is he's motivated largely by a desire to retain and expand Republican seats in the Senate and to retain his influence as Senate Majority Leader. And if he's a kind of cynical institutionalist of this kind, I don't think he wants to be Majority Leader of the Senate in a failed state. What good is it, right, to be Majority Leader? What power do you wield that's of any meaning if you end up with a dysfunctional government that can do nothing and is just spinning its wheels in a ditch? Even if you calculate that that's going to help your office holders next time, and we could have an interesting conversation about whether failed state dysfunction would or would not benefit Republicans if that's the approach that Mitch McConnell takes. I think what it does is it removes the value of the office he now holds if he pursues that policy. And his statements since Tuesday have been strongly suggestive that he does not want to take the scorched earth approach. I mean, McConnell has not backed up the president. McConnell explicitly criticized the president's claim of victory on election night. He didn't need to do that. He had no need to make a public statement criticizing the president that way. He has announced that his first priority when the new Congress meets is a new stimulus bill. Well, he was opposing a new stimulus bill, a week ago. I think the odds are that McConnell is going to be interested in using his influence to change Biden administration policies to the right. But my guess is that he's going to be willing to deal. And what that does is create a hopeful scenario of a US government that returns to an older model of compromise policymaking. I mean, the Obama administration was headed by a guy who basically didn't like politicians and hated his time in the Senate. Right? Barack Obama was kind of infamously dismissive of his fellow senators and actively prevented his own White House staff from spending time on the Hill building coalitions for his own policies, because Obama had such a dismissive view of the horse trading that is the warp and woof of normal life in a legislature. That is not Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the patron saint of horse traders everywhere. He's a guy who actually loves this stuff. He likes the Senate. He likes senators. I think given the institutional incentives of Mitch McConnell right now, and given the personality predispositions and political needs of the president-elect right now, my own best guess, right, on the way forward here is that we will have centrist compromise policymaking that actually can pass legislation. Now, that's going to require a series of balancing acts that will be very difficult to manage, both for the president and for McConnell. Right, McConnell is going to have to deal with the equivalent of the old Freedom Caucus, right? The old Tea Party that made the lives of the Republican leadership into the Obama administration so difficult. That same problem is going to confront McConnell. It won't be called the Tea Party anymore. It'll be called something else. I hope not QAnon, but it'll be called something else. But the same group of of high-profile senators that want to grab Trump's constituency are going to be acting to try and blow up these sorts of compromises, right? Cruz, Cotton, Hawley, and the rest. So it's going to be incumbent on McConnell, if he doesn't want to be majority leader of dysfunction, to manage that constituency. He's not going to silence them, but he's going to have to be able to manage them. Biden, similarly, there's a brewing fight between progressives and moderates in the Democratic Party right now. And so Biden is going to have the same set of balancing acts that he's going to have to do. But that's what professional politicians do. I mean, the political profession writ large is essentially about looking across a polyglot, differentiated body politic and slicing and dicing it to assemble governing coalitions by bringing together in a shifting way groups that don't always agree with each other, but that together constitute at least 51% of something, right? The popular vote in the state of Pennsylvania, or votes in the US Senate, in order to move forward. And McConnell, for whatever you think of him, is a pretty skilled professional Paul. And Joe Biden is a pretty skilled professional Paul. And they're both out of that older model, right? They both have this formative experience of deal making in the Senate. So given all that, what then is the policy prognosis for the kind of deals that might emerge? A brief word on what that looks like domestically, a slightly less brief word on what that looks like internationally, since after all, I'm supposed to talk about foreign affairs. And then I'll just throw things open for Q&A and conversation. I think on the domestic front, something that looks very much like the infrastructure plan that everyone thought Donald Trump might do is likely to emerge. I think there's enthusiasm on both sides of the aisle for this. I think it's likely to be framed as part of a stimulus package. And I think it's entirely plausible to see that moving forward. Something like criminal justice reform, I could imagine moving forward. But the one thing that this election shows domestically is the the ideological orientation of the American parties are completely scrambled now. Right? For most of my political life, certainly since the Reagan administration, the central fault line in American politics has been big government, small government. Right? Democrats believe in government as a positive force and want it to be bigger. Republicans view government as a necessary evil and want it to be smaller. That is no longer a meaningful fault line in American politics. The small government conservatism, I think, is basically dead. If the traditionalist wing of the Republican Party tries to revive it, they will get eaten alive by the Trump constituency, because the Trump constituency doesn't care about the size of government. The fault line that has emerged in American politics is between globalist elitist and populist nativist. And the size of government, both of those camps are perfectly okay with bigger government. The small government business conservatism of the Republican Party is now a niche view. One of the reasons Trump lost is because he campaigned as a populist and then governed as a traditional small government business Republican. And that there's very little constituency outside the country club anymore for that view. And both parties are now going to be actively trying to frame themselves as populists. The risk on the Republican side is they get themselves labeled as the party of big business, and they lose the populist constituency that elected Trump and that nearly elected him this time. The threat on the Democrat side is they get successfully labeled the way Trump labeled them in 2016 as the party of elites and the very poor, but that everybody in between goes Republican. Right? So if Democrats allow themselves to get painted as Hollywood and African Americans, then they're headed for defeat. And I think they know this and understand it. And therefore, both sides are competing actively for the part of the American electorate that has suffered economically in the last 2 generations. And what that does is it creates very broad-based support for things like an infrastructure program, which would enable both sides to reach out to this constituency to try and position themselves for this vote. So I think we're likely to see something like that on the domestic side. What about the international side? A lot of my policy community friends are breathing a sigh of relief, and they're hoping that, okay, now we can get back to traditional American foreign policy, right? Openness, institutions, alliances, free trade, right? All of that. And I think if a Biden administration does that, they're headed for another train wreck in 4 years. Because that traditional American approach to foreign policy looks like globalist elitism. That's a big part of what created this groundswell that got Trump elected in 2016. I think if we just think we're going to go back to the old playbook, I think Democrats are headed for a world of hurt. And my guess is that they're not going to do that. My guess is what they're going to do is something that intersects with that, but is reframed around a larger narrative of countering China. Much as there's kind of bipartisan interest in things like infrastructure programs on the domestic side, there is bipartisan interest in pushing back against China right now. Right? During the campaign, to the extent that foreign affairs came up at all, which it mostly didn't, it was the two sides competing with each other to see how mean they can be towards the Chinese. And if you think that openness to trade is in America's economic interest, which I do, if you think that an American leadership role in international institutions is in Americans' interest, which I do, if you think that alliances are in America's interest, which I do, right? The natural way to frame a version of those things in a way that doesn't look like elitist abandonment of, Red America is by doing it the same way it was done in the Cold War. Right? In the Cold War, all these policies were framed as part of opposition to a Soviet threat. And I think the way this stuff is going to get packaged now, looking forward, is as part and parcel of opposition to a rising China. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? This trade deal that Trump famously ran away from. The natural way to frame that is as a way of creating a trade arrangement that is part of a larger policy of opposing Chinese expansion, that we don't want all of our trading partners in the Pacific to just line up with China, trade with China, exclude us. Similarly, NATO is already starting to talk about the China threat. The general issue of openness to institutions, I think, similarly is likely to be reframed through this lens. Now, during the Cold War, there was this long debate over how threatening is the Soviet Union really? And there was all this push and haul with the Allies where Germany and the Low Countries and the French were worried that we were going to chain gang them into some unnecessary conflict with the Soviet Union because you cowboy Americans are so anti-Soviet, the Soviets aren't really all that bad. Right? We've seen this movie before, right? These tensions are natural in these kinds of relationships, and we'll see them again. And I hope we don't end up in a full-scale Cold War with China. That's not in anybody's interest. But I would not at all be surprised if a Biden administration foreign policy is kind of framed around the theme of the major challenge for the United States in the future is a rising China. We are adopting a holistic body of policy initiatives framed around this problem. And the challenge will be not to overdo it, not to end up in a true Cold War with the Chinese, but to manage this, which gets back to this issue of balancing acts. I think in the brighter scenario for the future, what we're looking at is a series of balancing acts in which a natural centrist who balances like a tightrope walker, Joe Biden, is not a bad choice for managing these kinds of, casting these kinds of balances. But I think that's what's going to be necessary if we're not going to end up in failed state status. So anyway, why don't I stop semi-free associating about events that I've thought deeply about for like 7 minutes and see what the group thinks and what the group wants to talk about. Good and gracious God, your house and your people creates an opportunity for us to come together. It creates an opportunity for us to talk to each other. It creates an opportunity for us to listen to each other. It creates an opportunity for us to hear each other, because as your people, we come to your house with a presumption that other Christians mean well. Help us to use this opportunity. Help us to better listen to each other, to better hear each other, and to better build the kind of kingdom of God on earth that you want for us in this time of change and turbulence. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.